This condition, which resembled a living death, suddenly vanished on the arrival of Mr. Briata, my husband's agent. A chamberlain accompanied him, and both came to take my elder son away from me on behalf of his father. My misfortunes had reached their height. Thus I was about to lose my dearest consolation. And at this of all moments, impossible though it may seem, I consented to give up my son. In spite of the fact that to do so broke my heart, I agreed to surrender the guardianship I had so fiercely striven to obtain in the courts of law. And why? Oh, mystery of a mother's love. How could I resist, since I had only misery and misfortune to offer him? He left me. Overcome by so many blows falling upon me simultaneously, I felt my moral energy give way under the shock. Nothing mattered any longer. I felt that my life and my strength were ebbing away little by little. To be sure, the newspapers and political pamphlets described how active I still was, and I was surprised to find that other people still believed I was alive when I had ceased to exist so far as my personal interests were concerned. I received an answer from Mr. de Flahault. The intensity of his despair alarmed me. He regretted he had not been one of those heroes who laid down their lives for our cause on the field of Waterloo. He wished, in spite of all the dangers it would involve, to come and explain matters to me, to seek to secure my forgiveness. I gave strict orders that he was not to do so. His grief touched me and aroused my sympathy. He swore in the most touching manner that his heart had never ceased to be attached to me. That was not enough. I should have believed him. I should have pitied him. I should still have loved him, if he had the courage to admit I loved someone else. Such a statement would at least have given me a sense of security, whereas the renewal of his vows of tender devotion aroused so many conflicting sentiments that my sufferings were increased. It was in vain that the thought of his despair would occasionally intervene and moderate their intensity. The charm had vanished once and for all. He had deceived me. I could forgive, but I could not forget. I feel grateful to Providence that at this time, when my life was still necessary to my children, I should have happened to be at Aix-les-Bains. It was undoubtedly the waters there which relaxed the tension of my nerves and saved my life. Then, too, the care of my younger son reminded me of duties I seemed too inclined to forget. He was naturally delicate, and his health was still further upset by the grief of seeing his brother leave us. I vowed not to succumb, for I was a mother, and no one can take a mother's place. But to live, one must have courage and strength. I sought both everywhere and refused to despair. I frequently went to see my sisters of charity in my hospital. One day a woman was brought in who was extremely ill. It was impossible to open the windows of her sick room. Suffocated by the odor, I stopped at the door, but was ashamed to do so since the sisters had not left her bedside. I made an effort to conquer my almost overpowering physical repulsion. I succeeded, and I remained beside the sick person as long as was necessary. This incident, insignificant in itself, taught me in a few seconds where real merits and real courage are to be found here below. These saintly women possessed both to a supreme degree. I compared myself to them and discovered how little I amounted to. What right had I to be always bewailing my fate? Did I deserve the happiness that so many other persons lacked? If I had fancied that I deserved it more than others, was that not a sign of undue pride? Heaven had given me a sensitive heart in order that I might sympathize with other people, a high rank in order that I may help them. What had I done with these gifts? I had made gifts of money, which did not matter to me because I was well off. I had protected those who were in distress, but their thanks were due those who had called my attention to their ills rather than to me. It is true, I had never refused to help anyone who was in need of assistance, but I had only cared for those to whom my attention was called. I did not seek them out for myself. No, I waited to be asked rather than volunteer my assistance. I gave orders to have alms distributed instead of distributing them personally. My kindness had been wholly passive. And what right had I to expect others to be more perfect than I was myself? Absorbed by my unhappy love affair, which was the more violent because I was obliged to combat and conquer it, I had only lived for one man. I had received the punishment I deserved. My friends, my relatives, all those who have been dependent on me and who have sympathized with me, you are right to complain, to consider that I am ungrateful, and to overwhelm me with your reproof. Then, as though these reproaches had awakened me after a long swoon, I sent some people presents, others long and affectionate letters. I wished to love everyone, in order no longer to confine my affection to one only. But the relief I sought most ardently was that offered by the religion, which teaches us so well how to be happy by seeking constantly to bring happiness to others, and by abandoning our fate in the hands of God. No, I declared, as I pressed my son impulsively in my arms. I will not let myself waste away. I can still do good. When grief overwhelms us, it seems as though our soul steeps itself in it complacently. We repulse everything that might remind us of life. In these heartbreaking moments, I almost forgot that I still had a brother, when suddenly, while I was worrying over what was to be my fate, I received a proof of his affection. He did not know my address and therefore sent a letter to someone he knew who lived near X, asking for news about me. This mark of sympathy revived my courage. Monsieur de Flahaut sent me a detailed story of his life. He declared that it had centered about his affection for me, but that he had feared my high standards of perfection. My heart was too pure to understand the frailty of his, and when he had been guilty of an instant's weakness, the fear of losing my esteem prevented him from telling me the truth. A woman who understood his character had managed to hold him by the constantly repeated threat of informing me of their liaison. But when he came and offered to devote his life to me, he acted as though he were abandoning anything that mattered. Was it not clear that I was the dominant factor of his entire existence? I cared for him too dearly. I needed too much the solace of his affection not to believe him. Once more I, who had a short time before sworn never to believe in it again, allowed myself to be ensnared in the web of human affection. As can readily be imagined, all these sentimental complications left me little desire to worry about politics. It became necessary to do so, however, and this awoke me from my lethargy. Every day my situation grew more critical. The Austrians were withdrawing their troops from Savoy, and I was about to find myself at the mercy of the French or Piedmontese government. My son and some other children of the same age had amused themselves by playing at soldiers in the courtyard with toy drums and sticks for muskets. This was enough to start reports that his mother was drilling regiments. Fouché, experienced and well-informed as he was, knew how much to believe in such cases, but the inexperience of his successors, Monsieur de Richelieu and Monsieur de Cazes, caused these accounts to be accepted blindly. The persecutions against me began again more violently than ever, as is usually the case when a credulous zeal animates those who are not accustomed to power. They are prepared to believe the most ridiculous things. It is these legends that encourage them to consider the harm they do as just measures of retaliation. I have never been able to understand why Monsieur le Comte de Vona, who, so I was told daily, was to bring me back my passports, wrote Monsieur Appel to return to Paris immediately and not have anything whatever to do with me anymore. I thus remained alone in the midst of all those perils from which until then I had been protected and which could only increase as time went on, without anyone to help me or advise me. Twice I sent Monsieur de Marmont to secure permission to go through Switzerland, but he was not allowed to go farther than Geneva. My horses, which I had left at my country place at Prigny, were not allowed to stay there. I saw plainly that there could be no hope of my remaining in Switzerland, but I spent my days reading descriptions of its natural beauties as though I were to remain myself among them. All I asked as compensation for what I'd lost was to have some beautiful landscape before my eyes. But political reasons interfered with the fulfillment of my desires. Those same reasons seemed to forbid my living anywhere. Indeed, where was I to go that my presence would not alarm someone? Could I stay in the territory of one of the great powers? I was suspicious of them. In Holland, I had reigned there. In Italy, my brother had been viceroy there. In Bavaria, I should have feared that my presence added to his difficulties. If some spot attracted me particularly, I was quickly forced to give up the idea of going there. My uncertainty increased the dissatisfaction of my companions. They could not realize that I was no longer mistress of my own movements. In spite of all the obstacles that stood in the way, they urged me to stay on at Prigny, whose advantages, its proximity to France and to my friends, the same customs, the same language as in France, they kept pointing out to me. Alas, I should have desired nothing better. But how was it possible for me to remain? I wore myself out explaining to them the strangeness of the position in which I found myself. I wished to make them understand it. Happiness requires no explanation. Misfortune does. I said to them over and over again, the only place we can be happy is in France, but we shall not be left in peace so long as we remain there. I was right. The foreign rulers separated without taking the trouble to decide what was to become of me. I received letters about my visit at Aix, which alarmed me. Dangers of all kinds seemed to accumulate around me. My friends advised me not to remain a day longer at Aix. The excesses which were being committed throughout southern France might easily extend to where I was. At this very time, my sole defenders of the Austrians withdrew and turned Aix over to the Piedmontese. General Roxmans, whose behavior had shown that he kept a necessary and benevolent watch over me, no longer commanded the territory. But what was I to do, since Geneva would not let me set foot on its soil? The idea finally occurred to me to write directly to the Swiss Diet to ask permission to cross their country and to proceed to Constance. The Grand Duke of Baden was a relative of mine. He had always behaved in a friendly manner toward me. Surely he would not refuse me an asylum. I confess I was astonished at the completeness with which the Emperor of Russia had severed all relations with me. I was prepared to admit that it was his policy to refuse me any active support, but surely that was no reason for his not displaying the slightest interest in my lot, surrounding as I was by so many dangers. He certainly must have been aware of my position. He finally seemed to be a little less harsh. He bought a portion of the picture gallery at Malmaison, which the Allies wished to seize. Doubtless, it was more to do my brother a favor than out of regard for me. Monsieur de Vaux, it is true, wrote me that the Russian envoy, Comte Capodistria, was the only one who had listened to his requests, and it was from this minister that I received passports authorizing me to proceed to Constance, at the same time as I received the answer from the Diet granting me permission to cross Switzerland. Thus, once more, it was the Emperor of Russia to whom I was indebted for these slight favors. But so many things had disappointed me in his attitude, I felt I could no longer consider him as a friend. After 4 months of anxiety, uncertainty, and danger, I left Aix, November 28, 1815. I left a spot where my heart had been cruelly wounded, a spot associated in my mind with the loss of a friend and the collapse of illusions. To avoid spending the night at an inn, I stopped at my country place at Prigny, which was on the borderline between France and Switzerland. About 4 o'clock in the morning, my servants were arrested, and my house surrounded by a band of 50 armed men. It was said I was escorting imperial generals in disguise out of the country. The gendarmes made a thorough search all over the house, except in my room, which they did not dare enter in spite of the strictness of their orders. I obliged them to do so, saying, "Come in, gentlemen. Do not be afraid of hurting my feelings. I am leaving France forever, and I am glad once more to see French uniforms." They were evidently ill at ease and withdrew at once. The sous-prefet sent me an order from Monsieur de Cazes, written in such rude terms that I smiled contemptuously. He expressly forbade me to set foot on French soil. The local authorities were held responsible for seeing that I obeyed this order. What heroic qualities was I supposed to possess that rendered my presence so terrifying? I left while the cannon at Geneva were saluting the arrival there of the Prince of Metternich. I passed through the canton of Vaud without any incident occurring. At Payerne, just as I was about to have supper, a Frenchman sent word he wished to speak to me. It was General Aimé. "What imprudence this is on your part!" I exclaimed. "May it not lead you directly into danger?" "Madame, I owe you my life. I heard you were staying here. How could I resist the opportunity to express my gratitude?" He then described how, with the passport I had given him, he had successfully evaded the search that had been made for him. One night, having stopped at an inn in the canton of Valais, the innkeeper had asked him to share his room with another traveler whose carriage had broken down. He consented. Who should the other traveler be but Monsieur de Blacas, who was going to Naples to act as French ambassador there? It was to Monsieur de Blacas' house that General Aimé had been taken on March 19th, accused of wishing to desert to the emperor. He would have been shot had it not been for what took place on the 20th. Consequently, he had lost no time in dressing and hurrying off into the mountains. Later, he had taken refuge in a little isolated chateau inhabited by former royalist emigrants from Paris, who knew what it was to be in distress and who had kept his secret and given him a post as tutor for their children. The alacrity with which he hastened to greet me proved fatal to him. He attracted the attention of several of the men who shadowed my movements and was shortly afterwards obliged to leave his hiding place for fear of being handed over to the French authorities. He wrote to me at that time. My brother and I sent him money to rejoin his wife and sail for the United States. He was captured at Hanover and thrown into prison where, so I'm told, he lost his mind. I have noticed that in general, during political upheavals, men have less moral resistance than women. They are more easily confused and dismayed. The reason is simple enough. A man obeys the promptings of ambition. It is natural that he should lose hope if he sees the object of his desires escape him. No blow could be more cruel. A woman, on the contrary, is all affection, can only be wounded through her affections, and is therefore more courageous regarding everything that does not affect her in that respect. From Payerne, I went on to Béarn, where I also spent the night. I left my carriage at the entrance of the little town of Murat. In spite of the cold, I enjoyed making a little sketch of this snow-covered landscape. Suddenly, I saw armed men who had been watching me for some time advance toward me. They informed me they had instructions to put me under arrest. I was not moved by this. Nothing could astonish me any longer. I simply remarked that in the past the Swiss had performed a more notable exploit at Murat. The only inconvenience the arrest caused me was to oblige me to wait in a wretched tavern in the bitter cold till Monsieur de Marmont could obtain explanation of this order. He was forced to return twice to Fribourg, and the council, composed of the high dignitaries of the canton, took 2 days to make up their minds what to do. They gave as excuse that it was necessary for them to teach the National Committee a lesson because the committee had never announced officially that I was coming. Never announced it, that is, to the canton of Fribourg, which had nothing to do with the matter as I was not stopping within its confines. The real reason was that local authorities were anxious to display their authority and show how they could revenge themselves upon a queen who had lost her throne for their long submission to the power of her family. Much has been said about the ambitions of great men. Is it not, after all, more bearable than the petty vexations inflicted by little people, animated by trifling motives? As I had been obliged to spend 2 days in a miserable inn at Murat, the persons who were with me expected every moment to see Monsieur and Madame Portalis, whose chateau was nearby, come to see me. It would have been natural for Madame de Portalis, whose marriage had been arranged by my mother and who was indebted to her for her education and dowry, to treat me with some consideration. Neither she nor her husband appeared. After having received so many favors from us, this conduct on their part might seem astonishing, but I still cared enough about the man who I had hoped would marry my friend, Madame de Broc, and the woman whom the Empress had treated as her own daughter, to try to find some excuses for them. I almost regretted my presence, which caused their conduct to be severely criticized in Paris. I even heard that in order to defend themselves, they told all sorts of absurd stories about me without stopping to remember that the most painful accusations that can be made against us are those of people we consider our friends. I was saddened to see more and more clearly the melancholy fact that adversity is the only real test of friendship, as it is of love. I arrived at Bern, where Monsieur de Krudener, the Russian ambassador, treated me with the greatest respect. He had for a long time been attached to the Russian embassy in Paris and recalled the manner in which we had received him. It was doubtless thanks to him that I succeeded in leaving the city. So great was the hatred against the name I bore. The landman himself, Monsieur de Vatteville, forgetting the kindness of my mother to his son and his wife when they were in Paris, was rude enough to send one of his cousins, who was a police official, to call on me. This official inquired who the man was who had dined with me at the inn of Pierre. I told him that I did not know the person's name and was not prepared to answer any more questions about him. My servants were taken into custody and obliged to describe the appearance of poor General Aimé, whom fortunately they had seen only on this one occasion. Intentionally, they gave an entirely false description. I left this canton under the escort of a colonel of the local police force and followed by all the spies of the region. It was both amusing and ridiculous to see all the precautions and the fears that the approach of a feeble woman and a child of 7 could provoke. The behavior of the authorities struck me as so silly that at times it made me smile. At other times, it filled me with a sort of pride. I must count for something after all, I said to myself. I have held high rank. I have encouraged many people who have met with reverses. As I sympathized with them and did what I could to relieve their distress, I felt that everyone would do the same. I see I was wrong. Thus, my behavior must have been meritorious. This idea satisfied me sufficiently to allow me to endure with the same calm all the vexations which were inflicted on me. Monsieur de Krudener again made me realize how indifferent I had become to the Emperor of Russia, who on his journey through Switzerland, although he knew where I was, did not even trouble to ask his ambassador about me. Yet I could not believe that he had previously been insincere as his attitude toward me. People must have been mistaken in saying he simply acted from motives of policy in being friendly with me in 1814 and hostile toward me in 1815. I prefer to believe that the explanation of his change in attitude is to be found in his naturally suspicious character and in the intrigues planned to increase those suspicions as far as I was concerned.